It says that participants are coming in.
So we can wait a few minutes for all the participants to get in. Welcome to those that are already logged in. This is Uriel Kukierman speaking. Just for you to know that we are waiting a few minutes for other participants to log in. Meanwhile, let me tell you that the presenters are all logged in. We have here Theo Andrew, Harold Hurson, and Donna Riley. We have also Hans Hoyer, and also Kayla and Anna from the Secretariat of IFES. And we are still waiting for the participants to log in. We have 11 participants so far, and we will wait just 2 more minutes for other participants. Well, I can see that Steve Fernandez, good morning or good afternoon, Steve Fernandez, I don't know where you are, has posed the first question. And but before that, before reading and answering this question, I want all of you to know that and I guess that all of you have already seen, have already watched the videos that our presenters have prepared, and that we will have a discussion about the subject, which is ethics in engineering, based on what you have already watched in their videos, in the presenters' videos. So with no further ado, and with 12 participants at this moment, let's begin with the discussion with this first question. I don't know if this, well, this question is not particularly for any of the presenters, so any of you want, are you the presenters, are you reading the question? Are you able to read the question?
Yes.
Okay. Does any of you want to answer it?
Well, I'll make a comment to start the discussion.
Yes, please, Harold.
First of all, thank you, Steve, for this question, which I think is an extremely important issue, and one which, in my own opinion, you know, engineering faculties often are reluctant to address directly, because it has a lot to do with institutional funding and program funding and things like this. So it really challenges, I think, some ethical principles, and we need to know not only you know, where we stand on such a thing, but also how to present these kinds of conflicts to students. So I think that you know, just preliminarily speaking from the point of view of pedagogy, I would think it would be advisable to have something like a case study.
Sorry for interrupting, Harold. This was my mistake. We haven't read the question. One of the participants is telling us that they are unable to see the question. So if you are able to summarize the question you are answering, please.
Oh, okay. So Steve wrote saying that he'd like to discuss the ethics of engineering and engineering programs aimed at weapons development. His own university partners with Lockheed Martin in offering undergrad and grad certificates in combat engineering. He says some of his students told him that they were working on missile engineering. And then he goes on to comment about the use of Lockheed Martin missiles in the Saudi-backed war in Yemen. And so the atrocities or war tragedies that have resulted. And so he is asking about how, as engineering educators, we ought to be addressing this kind of ethical challenge. And where I was going was to say, one, that I think this is a vitally important question, and two, that we need to get started by perhaps using in our institutions a case study approach to honestly unpack all of the dimensions of this and guide students to understand what responsible action would be in their case.
Okay, thank you, Harold. Theo, Donna, do you want to add something to this question?
Sure. I'll just add, I have a resource to recommend, which is there's a book called Engineering and War that's published by Morgan and Claypool, written by Dean Newsma, Ethan Blue, and a third author. I'll get that for you and post it in the Q&A so that you can have that. And I think it's a nice focused discussion of exactly the questions that you're raising.
Okay, thank you, Donna. Theo, do you want to add something?
Yes. Okay, I've just unmuted. This is a simple question, a very important question, with a very loaded answer, because the answers are not simple. In a nutshell, if I were to give my personal view on this, many of my colleagues and myself were put in positions, or at least a position within the South African context under apartheid, as to whether we will work in certain industries. And we had to take a strong, conscientious objector stance and say absolutely no, because those very institutions were destroying the society that we were trying to build. Now, the question becomes, at what point do you draw the line, or do you draw a boundary? So the one extreme form, well, you leave the country, well, that doesn't do much good. The question is, well, you leave the company, or the question is that you ask for another assignment. And those boundaries are a function of individual choices depending on your particular ethics. Now, if you speak to the corporate side will say, well, we have a set of corporate ethics. Whether that's possible, I think it's possible, but corporate ethics always have a vested interest in finance more than ideology. So the point is, and this is why it's such a loaded answer, because it really depends on the individual choices that one makes and your decisions based on that. And I like Errol's view when he says that these are the case studies that we need to pose pedagogically within the curriculum. And instead of dictating to engineering students what he or she should do, one should learn, so to speak, how to make the most appropriate decisions based on their worldview and on their set of ethics. In this particular case, the other reason why it's perhaps more loaded is simply because one has to ask the question whether it was deliberate or not deliberate. I don't know. all we hear is the news and the apologies given. Nevertheless, the question remains, do we engage in engineering practice that deals with weapons of mass destruction? In my view, I will have to make an individual choice.
Okay, thank you, Theo. And we have received another question from Kavita Dwaram, asking, can you also explain where and how ethics can be introduced in computer science and engineering discipline? This is the question. Who wants to begin with the answer?
Well, I'll answer from, again, sort of a curricular or pedagogical point of view. And what I'm going to say, I would also apply to not to all engineering programs. And that is, I think that the best way to introduce ethics in engineering is to integrate ethical problems within as many courses as possible. Design courses ought to include as one of the specified constraints that students have to work with, a list of ethical aspects, so that ethics is not seen by the student as something which is sort of an add-on that may or may not be essential to ethical practice, or will not see that ethics is something that you can simply outsource to experts. It has to be understood, I think, as the responsibility of all engineers to reflect on the ethical dimensions of everything they do. Now, I do believe that in a discipline like civil engineering, sort of identifying the ethical dimensions of projects is extremely easy. And if you look at lists of case studies, you see that many of the case studies are focused around large public projects or things like this that civil engineers are more likely to be involved in. But I think that it really doesn't take too much imagination for people in any engineering discipline to see that there are specific ethical questions that abound within their practice on every level and at every time. I think of engineering in terms of the CDIO paradigm, so that CDIO means conceive, design, implement, operate. And so in the conceiving of a project and what needs to be done and so on, one really ought to think through, what is this for? What is the benefit? What is the social good that may or may not result from this? What are the optimum possibilities on both ends of the spectrum and so on? And at that level, on the conceived level, one then sort of develops a list of ethical dimensions for the project going forward.
Okay, thank you. And a question appeared during Theo's previous speech. And you can read it, Theo. It says that some universities do not give that type of freedom to maintain by ethics with public to raise admission level in campus universities are ready to do anything in South Asian universities. I don't know if this is addressed to you particularly. I don't know if you want to comment this question.
I don't understand it fully.
Can you read it in the question window?
Yeah. It says some universities do not give the type of freedom to maintain by ethics with public to raise admission level in campus universities, or to raise admission level in campus universities are ready to do anything in South Asian universities. I guess if I interpret the question correctly, it's talking to the issue of you know, what price are you prepared to pay to sell your soul, to put it very bluntly
Yes.
and colloquially? That's what I read into the question. And so, once again, there are no simple answers in ethics. But to address this question, this is where I believe that you start with a core of students with some serious ethical convictions, and you start advocating, and you start building up some level of activism to make sure that those universities, which are supposed to be societal institutions, reflect the views of society. Now, that might mean, well, societies might agree, well, we create weapons of mass destruction, and then you have to take an individual standpoint. But all this points to is that we have to keep a very consistent message in accordance with our convictions to bring about the transformation or change that we would like to see. At some point, if it doesn't happen, it doesn't mean to say that you change your ethical standpoint of view. You're going to have to make a decision whether you're going to be part of that university or make the choice and join another university. It depends on your ethical boundaries once again.
Okay. I want the participants to know that Donna has posted in the chat window the link that she has previously announced, just for you to know. While we are waiting for some other question, I myself want to pose a question to the panelists, if I can do so. What happens when religious or social or familiar, ethical or moral costumes of students are confronted with those of the professor, with those of the institutional or professor guidelines? What do you think about this kind of confrontation between the personal beliefs or religious norms confronted with those of the professor or the institution?
And I could do a take on that.
Yes, please.
So this is not uncommon in a very diverse society and multicultural society, such as we have in South Africa, and I guess in many other parts of the world as well. The code of ethics or the code of conduct for professors follows along the line of circular truth, if I might use the term. If the professor is insisting on a particular worldview and students need to follow that worldview and does not allow students to challenge his or her worldview, I would say we need to take some serious action here, because you don't want those professors in the classroom. Now, within the sciences and engineering, perhaps it's a little bit more simple, because if you are teaching a course in physics, for example, it's less complicated. But when you're interfacing certain physics to society, for example, the belief in God or whether God exists, then you should allow for appreciation of different worldviews. You do not have to agree. But I can listen to my Hindu friends, I can listen to my Muslim friends, I can listen to the atheists or to the agnostics, and try to understand the reasoning or the rationale behind their particular worldview. I can still disagree, but at least I showed some appreciation for the worldview. And at the end of the day, I will keep my point and disagree, and I hope that the others will disagree with me as well. And I hope that will happen to the professor as well. But it is healthier to have different worldviews in a classroom setting on a complex topic than having some kind of singular worldview.
Thank you, CEO. Donna, do you want to comment this about this question?
Sure. I mean, I think just to build on what Theo was saying, I think that, in fact, helping students to be able to see an ethics problem from multiple perspectives is, in fact, one of the main cognitive goals that we want them to achieve. So we want them to participate in what we would call sort of a divergence in their thinking and brainstorming, that there's a creative element to teaching ethics where you want to generate as many possible ways of looking at a problem, of approaching a problem, of preventing an ethical situation before it happens, and also of addressing a situation once it does happen. You want to be exploring the entire space of how to approach ethics. And so I think in that way, you can really make room for a lot of different perspectives.
Thank you, Donna. Harold, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Theo and Donna have said. I think this is really a multifaceted problem. And it's becoming more complex as we have more international exchanges, and we have multiculturalism sort of in front of us in the classroom. And I think every instructor has to recognize that your students represent a diverse and not always complementary set of worldviews. And so your challenge and task as teachers, how do you navigate in that environment while respecting all views that are worthy of respect, and at the same time not shying away from the conflicts that may come up. Engineering, of course, is not exactly like science, because engineering is very much a value-filled social discipline. And if we take something like bioengineering, we can immediately think of topics where just to sort of unpack the technology and talk about the possibilities in certain things is going to be problematic, possibly even offensive to people of certain kinds of worldviews. So I think it's very important for instructors to remember that they are not advocates for a particular position. It's important for instructors to remember that they do not represent the special interests of industry or of a particular or of any other kind of force in the world. They do not represent that in the classroom, even though they might in their own lives be devoted to that. And so if I have a particular religious point of view or a particular point of view about political organization or something, it's really gets in the way of the discussion of the substance of the class if I try to sort of package my presentation in one of those contexts. I'm looking forward to struggling with this a little bit, because, as I mentioned, I'm going to be teaching in China, where there are very specific expectations and views that universities identify with that flow from government positions. All of the students will have already taken another kind of ethics course mandated by the government, which tells them what's right and what's wrong in ways that, as an academic ethicist, I don't do. And so I'm sort of trying to counsel myself at this point about how do you maintain the kind of openness and polyvalent respect toward positions at the same time that you are sort of quite willing to penetrate into topics which do inherently have ethical questions, sort of slapping us in the face.
Okay, thank you, Harold. We have 2 questions in line, so let's go to the first one. Elsie Mayo is asking, what in your views would be the strongest indicator that ethics has taken its proper place in the education of engineers? Who wants to begin answering this question? Donna, okay.
Sure, I'll start. One of the things that always strikes me as an engineer myself who didn't have a lot of ethics education in undergrad is that it is striking to me that for a profession that claims to require ethics education, how many engineers are in the academy are completely uncomfortable with teaching engineering ethics to students. And this has always sort of puzzled me, but it also makes perfect sense in that I had very little exposure in undergrad, and then I took a course in my graduate program on engineering ethics, and later became involved, went to a 5-day workshop to learn more about research ethics, and ended up teaching research ethics to undergraduate researchers. Next thing I know, I'm in my first faculty position. We're starting a new engineering program, and everybody kind of looked at each other and said, oh, which one of us is going to teach ethics? And they sort of pointed at me and said, well, you know the most about it. Why don't you do it, right? And so it's, and I was happy to do it. I did have enough of a comfort level to do it. But the fact that none of my colleagues really had a high comfort level with ethics speaks to the sort of lack of exposure that we tend to have in our programs. So for me, I think one of the indicators that ethics has taken its proper place in the education of engineers is that every single engineer that's in a faculty position would be entirely comfortable discussing ethics, modeling ethics, and being present with students, even if we use models where we bring in philosophers and ethics experts to teach either with us or we send students to take a course that's taught by philosophers. At the end of the day, when students are attending courses with engineering faculty, those engineering faculty should have at least a working familiarity with ethics.
Uriel, I think your mic is muted. I can't hear you. I see you speaking.
Oh, sorry. Yes, sorry. I want to know if Theo or Harold want to add something to Donna's answer. Very briefly, because we have 2 more questions.
I think,
Theo?
Donna, put your finger on it. Engineering faculty are very often a little bit intimidated by the idea of adding ethics or teaching ethics or presenting ethical discussions within the context of their classes. But I think it's extremely important that they do so. Of course, working with philosophers or ethicists or historians or economists or anybody, engineering professors should be doing that for many, many reasons. And so I think she's hit the nail on the head.
So my quick contribution, Uriel, is that I think the professional societies, professional boards, such as ABET, the engineering councils, et cetera, should take this very seriously. If we accept that engineering makes a significant contribution to social justice through the use of technology, for example, we have to accept that technology is not culture-free, it is value-laden. And if you take that as a starting point, then it raises some serious ethical issues, and therefore it should be a compulsory module, not one of the, in South Africa, we call it complementary studies. I think in the US, the term is core. It should be part of the core curriculum. In other words, you cannot graduate without going through at least one, if not several courses integrated with the other courses. And then only one can graduate. Then I know that we are giving serious attention to that.
Okay, thank you, Theo. Let's go to the next question. I will read it because in order to allow all the participants to know what is the question about. Steve Fernandez is saying much engineering is directed towards work for corporations and the military. My previous question raised work for the military. I'd like to hear discussions regarding the acceptance of the capitalist economic structures. Many economists, Marxists and non-Marxists, have noted that capitalist economic structure lead to wealth concentration and entrenched poverty. The notion of perpetual economic growth and profit has led to a level of consumerism and waste production that causes dangerous level of environment destruction. Why should engineering students be exposed to different forms of economic systems that may lead to less social stratification and less environmental harm? Wow, what a question. It's very difficult to ask you for a short answer, but please, a short answer. Can you, Donna, please?
Sure. I've written about this some. I have a book on engineering and social justice that's now a bit old, it's 10 years old now. But I did write a little bit about this at the time. And I think to just sort of I'll take the two sort of different issues that you raised separately. First of all, I would say, please write about this. I think we need more people asking questions like this in this space, right? So please do, I encourage you to participate in all these conversations that are happening. And one of the places that this conversation is happening is in a network called Engineering, Social Justice, and Peace. And I encourage you to, there's a conference, an annual conference at esjp.org. You can look at what that organization is doing. There's folks there doing this work. I think one thing I would say, first of all, on the issue of consumerism and waste production, I have taught a life cycle assessment project, which is a fairly traditional now method to sort of analyze environmental impacts of engineered products. However, I added an ethics dimension to my life cycle assessment assignment when I taught it that encouraged students to think about sort of the green economy and how kind of the marketing of green products may in fact be sort of feeding into a consumerist culture, particularly in the United States. And so I think those are questions that can be raised in an engineering context, and in fact taking that into account is a really important question when you talk about environmental problems. So one of the classic questions in life cycle assessment is, plastic or paper bags at the grocery store, and of course the answer is, well, maybe you don't need a bag at all, or maybe you can bring your own bag. Maybe you don't buy as much. Maybe you only take what you can carry, right? So those kinds of ways of thinking creatively, again, come into play where you can ask questions about the overall culture and how engineering is interfacing with it and how it might interface differently. So when it comes to the sort of wider economic structures, this has come into my teaching again in teaching engineering and global development in particular. So when engineers are involved in projects that are intended to reduce poverty, I think it's really important that we look at the economic systems in which we're operating. So for example, I did some work more than 10 years ago now in Nicaragua, and the idea was to create some local economic chains of production that local folks controlled in Nicaragua. But we had to be very savvy about understanding what the global neoliberal economic context was going to do to any interventions that we were going to propose. So, for example, if local folks were going to produce products that could be imported more cheaply from China, they really weren't going to be successful with that strategy. So understanding the wider economic structure was critical to doing good engineering in that case. And so there's lots of different ways that this comes in, and as Uriel said, you can't really answer this quickly, but there is a lot of stuff out there, and I can refer you to a couple of resources, esjp.org, and the work in that group is a place to start.
Thank you, Donna. Harold, do you want to add something?
Well, I think that I have a concern that engineering education, with its important emphasis on innovation and entrepreneurship, has kind of made it look as though we don't have, as engineers for social justice or engineers for, the environment or anything like this, any particular concern with the neoliberal dominant economic structure, and that the sort of the extreme version of my concern is that many students see engineering as a way to, sort of invent something or develop something clever that they can quickly bring to market and monetize. And they see engineering as having that kind of limited sort of range and scope. So I think we really have to emphasize that engineering is for the public good, and that this means that we have to engage with critical thinking about the dominant economic systems and not simply accept them or take them for granted. The example that Donna gave, I thought was a perfect example of the work in Nicaragua, I think. Was a perfect example of how students can become aware of the necessity to become well-informed and open-minded about economic and political global solutions.
Something to add, Theo?
Just very quickly, I agree with the points made. Just to add that, well, firstly, I like the way the question was phrased, because it is not claiming that any one particular economic philosophy is correct or that will bring about social justice, because that is the age-old issue that we are dealing with as societies around the world. And one thing I've noticed, whether you're in socialist countries like some of them in Europe, or capitalist countries, or more neoliberal, as Errol has said, or social democracies in Scandinavia, there are still some very serious ethical questions in engineering practice. So the question remains, how can we in our curriculum embed the notion of social justice? Because it's possible to bring about social justice within all of those economic types. To change policy and to change the entire economic type in a particular country needs much more than just the engineering curriculum. It needs a whole host of other professions, politicians, etc., to bring about that kind of evolutionary process. But the point remains, I agree, we should educate engineers about the different, the impact of the different economies, but emphasize more social justice within those economic types.
Okay, thank you, Theo. And I will go to the next question by Bala Champur, which comes divided in two parts, but I will read these two parts together. Technology-aided information or misinformation will enter everyone's life with the press of key that sends that information to many followers or many who are in the network. Where does ethics come into play to stop someone pressing that key? Who should be the supervisor of this ethical behavior, the provider or the sender? The assumption I am making is based the technology affordances of 21st century, including artificial intelligence, social media, smartphone technology that is mobile, and many other game access that purely exists for entertainment without any ethical grounding. So the floor is open for any of you who wants to answer this question. Harold?
Well, my thoughts about this focus on how technology has changed the nature of human action. So very, very modern or contemporary technology is complex in a way that most individuals using it are not fully understanding or comprehending what they're doing. It's made very long-range and powerful, overwhelmingly powerful actions, easy to do. It, as was alluded to in the question, is certainly permitting sort of routine reviewing or even choices to be made, by devices rather than by human reflection. And so I think that we have to be particularly cautious about how we deploy technology, because we can do things that we don't know what we're doing. So the sort of unanticipated consequences leads me to be very almost fearful about what we might be able to do through the sort of apparently benign use of technology. So that's a question for which I don't have an answer, though. I mean, how you do this, I don't think that we can simply regulate everybody's behavior. I certainly wouldn't advocate that at all. But then how do we ensure that people make wise decisions using technology or humane? I don't know. I don't think we have any idea.
Theo, Donna, do you want to add something?
I could, it requires more thought, but I'm of the view that playing any game implies that you have to make some choices, right? So if you're dealing with inanimate objects, sure, you make less ethical choices, I would assume, because ethics is really directly related to a person or persons in society. But the way I understood the question was that, do you make video games just for the sake of pleasure? And I'm not too sure, there's no harm in that. The question I will pose, well, if the games that you are building, it's going to be opposite to what you want to do, if the games are going to inculcate a culture within you where you deliberately do not consider ethics, and you become exploitative, then there's a serious ethical issue about the manufacture or the design and manufacture of the game. But if it's purely for pleasure, like a chess game, for example, electronic chess game, I don't see that it breaches an ethical situation. I stand to be corrected, but that will be my simple view on this.
Okay, thank you. Donna, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I would just add, I posted a link for a resource that I used some time ago now. So the article's a bit old. It's about the game Civilization, which a lot of people have played. So it's a nice entry point. But it shows the ethical choices embedded in the game Civilization and sort of how it trains people to prefer certain social arrangements and so on. So I think that's a nice jumping off point for the conversation. I think that, like the issue of autonomous vehicles, and I know some folks here, Joe Herkert in the United States is doing some work on the ethics of autonomous vehicles. What you have is a situation where there are so many actors in this complex arrangement that it raises a bunch of really interesting and really complex ethical questions. And you in your first part of the question, you sort of raise that question of, who bears responsibility? And I think the answer is there are lots of different ways that we all share responsibility, but that's not a throwaway answer. That is a invitation to really explore all the different situations in which responsibility of different actors in this complex environment come into play. So when you have a provider of content, or you have someone clicking a button, or you have recipients of information, and then what they do with that information, you have a whole bunch of different ethical situations and decisions that are being made, all of which could be points for creative intervention if people come into just an awareness and consciousness of the ethics that are being decided as we develop all of these different technologies and use them.
Okay, thank you, Donna. And Previously, Kenneth Lamb, while you, Donna, were speaking in your previous intervention, asked, and I guess this was a question for you, is there an example you can give on how you teach ethics in a technical engineering course, a particular exercise, favorite discussion topic?
Sure, sure. So I do this in lots of different ways, and my my main advice to anybody thinking about doing this is to start small. Pick a small way that you can try something out in your course and see where it goes from there. Some examples I have taught. So the way my curriculum was structured, where I taught at Smith College, we introduced in our introductory course, we taught students how to do ethics case studies. And so we were able in our technical courses to teach case studies and to just sort of embed a few of those in as assignments over the course of the semester. So and a lot of people do this even without that introduction. You have to do a little crash course on how to do a case study, but once you've done that with students, you can embed all kinds of case studies. And I recommend the online Ethics Center as a place to find resources for case studies that match any given course that you might teach in engineering. They have them organized by fields. You can go in and search by topic area. I taught engineering thermodynamics for many years, about 12 years. And so over time, I developed a whole bunch of different case studies, some of which I wrote myself. One of the sort of ripe areas for me, I found in thermodynamics, was to help students see that thermodynamics is really just about energy, and energy issues have all kinds of currency in public discourse. And so I taught ethics cases related to global climate change, and it was very convenient. I taught the course in fall, and so along about December, there was usually a climate summit, which people could read about in the news, and it was an opportunity to introduce case studies about climate negotiations and how we think at a really macro level about the ethical choices embedded in the technologies we're choosing for energy and climate. So that was one. And I have a book called, it has this unwieldy title, Engineering Thermodynamics and 21st Century Energy Problems. And that book provides a whole bunch of the ways in which I taught not just ethics, but also communication skills and other and public policy and other kinds of considerations in a thermo class. One of the things that I would do that I think is useful is to ask students to identify the kinds of ethics questions that might arise in relation to a topic, because students can be very creative and can find really interesting questions. So it really does depend on the technical engineering course you're teaching, but most of them you can find an interesting and even a current ethics study. So for example, if I were teaching thermodynamics now, I might use the VW emissions scandal. I teach the diesel cycle in thermodynamics. So as they're learning the diesel cycle, they could learn about what were the challenges VW faced in terms of trying to introduce diesel engines that met certain environmental standards, and then what introduced their decision to cheat in terms of those emissions, and to follow that case study. So that's kind of what I do. The how is, it's usually a short writing assignment where students analyze a case, and then we spend maybe half a class discussing that case, and then the other half of the time doing the technical material assigned for that day.
Okay, thank you, Donna. We have another question from Elsie Mayo. What are the structural inhibitions that engineering educators will have to address as they include engineering in their classrooms? How can they best address them? Structural, as in the entrenched culture of their institutions. Who wants to begin with the answer? Theo, please.
I could go with that, because we're in the throes of, for the last 3 years or so, changing our curriculum. Well, Thomas Kuhn wrote a wonderful book that we've often quoted, the Structure of Scientific Paradigms. And in a nutshell, it's very difficult to change those belief systems, those paradigms, and those traditions. Part of the problem I saw within engineering very much relates to professional societies as a matter of interest, although we see the importance for it. But it is those all boys clubs, which I've labeled in something that I wrote some time ago, that has been the biggest stumbling block, because what you want to do is produce graduates to do the kind of work that industry wants right now. It has very little to do about changing society, or they don't care whether this person will be out of a job in 10 years' time as the science and as the technology changes. So one way of addressing that is to find the champions. If you are the dean of the faculty, like I am, I found champions, 2 or 3 people that I could have conversations with and start to slowly feed in. Do not ask for a revolution. It ain't going to happen within an engineering school. But you can find those areas where you can start to make a difference. To relate to Donna's point, if you take the laws of thermodynamics, if you teach it in a totally reductionist fashion, you're not going to be able to bring in ethics because you're dealing with the laws of nature. But when you interface that to society, which is what engineering is all about, then there's a whole host of ethical issues that come about. And so you can choose those courses where it's easier to bring about those changes. Perhaps thermodynamics may not be the best example because it's taught in a very traditional way by the physics faculty, et cetera, et cetera. But there is no inherent structure or impediment that's put there as such. It is something that we have grown accustomed to over the years, and we find it very difficult to change. And what I found in my experience that, for example, we offer 2 languages to all our engineering students, Mandarin and French, and we have a justification. And we are finding, actually, we are producing far better engineers, better defined in people that understand society and different cultures much better. And so when they get to the technology design, is far more appropriate than just trying to find the best science that will give you the best kind of technology results, quote, close quote.
Who wants to continue with answering this question? Donna, please.
Sure. So I think, one of the fundamental issues is that people just don't see it as belonging in the engineering curriculum. And that's sort of a fundamental mindset issue that can be really difficult to change. And it does require a culture change to help folks see that ethics belongs. So I think, one of the things that happens a lot of places is people say, well, this is required by some accrediting body or what have you. And so it becomes this thing that you have to do rather than a thing that people really care about and take responsibility for, except for a few champions, right? And so using those champions and building a consensus that not only is this required and we do it because it's required, but actually this is something unique about our institution, that we take this seriously and we do this better than other people, right? So making it a feature of what your institution does and something that you take pride in, I think it's an important strategy to use. One of the other really big places where people push back is on what I call coverage, right? So coverage is, we used to say this when I taught at Smith College in Massachusetts for 13 years. This is a liberal arts college. So we were trying to innovate a different engineering curriculum altogether that integrated liberal arts ideas. And we kept saying to each other, coverage is the enemy. Coverage is the enemy, right? We taught an engineering science curriculum, so it was integrated across engineering disciplines. And I went in there as a chemical engineer teaching thermodynamics thinking, well, I have to teach the fugacity, right? Which is a concept that chemical engineers teach in thermo, but a mechanical engineer wouldn't necessarily cover that, right? Because it's sort of it's in chemical equilibrium and so on, and you wouldn't necessarily do that. But we all had our own upbringing where we felt committed to teach certain kinds of content and a certain amount of coverage of that content rather than focusing on the actual learning outcomes of the students. And so we can use what we know about engineering education now to focus on what are the skills and knowledge and abilities that we need our students to acquire. And if they're meeting those outcomes, we don't have to assign that nth problem set. I used to tell my students that there's this kind of curve, right, of diminishing returns. You know, you do those first few problems on your problem set and you're gaining a lot, but when you get out to problem 12, you know, you're kind of just practicing stuff and you're not necessarily learning. For some students, you need more practice. Other students, you could move on. And so helping students individualize their education and really get to a point where we make room for what's important, right? And if ethics is a priority, and there's lots of ways that we know that it is, if engineering is going to put itself forward globally as a profession, then we need to have professional ethics be part of our curriculum. And if that's true, then we have to make room for it in our courses. And that can be the hardest thing for individual faculty, looking at their syllabus and really making the hard choices about what am I not going to do instead, and to help people realize it's not a zero-sum game. I found in teaching thermodynamics, I found lots of ways that I could help students understand really difficult concepts like entropy by teaching other things in the class like ethics and other ways of sort of looking at the world. That by taking multiple perspectives in my course on ethics problems, students were able to see entropy in a different way, because students get locked into thinking about things that balance, right? And entropy is this thing that's an inequality, and it's really hard for students to grasp. But if they can step outside that mindset for a minute and reflect on that, you know, this is a scientific concept that takes a different form. It doesn't fit an equation in a nice, neat way. Maybe we need to think about it differently. They actually had big learning gains in the technical content because we also did those other things in the course. So, so all of this is just to say that that there are, I think, you know, this is a great question, because there are structural inhibitions that really prevent ethics from becoming a widespread and central part of engineering curricula. But, you know, the best thing to do is to have those champions, to build a consensus around the importance of doing this, see it as a priority, and then fight those day-to-day battles about making room for what's really important.
Okay, we are running out of time. Harold, do you want to make a very, very short comment about this question? I'm not hearing you, Harold.
Sorry. No, I don't have anything to add on this. I concur with the comments made, for sure.
Okay. So in this point, we have only one more question, but it's not just a short issue. Steve Fernandez, I will summarize his question by reading the last part of his question. He says, I'd like to hear a discussion on whether there should be some sort of Hippocratic oath for engineers. I guess this discussion will take more time than we have. We run out of time. I invite our speakers, if you want to answer this. This is not a question, but kind of open discussion. If you want to continue this discussion with Steve and with all our participants by other means, I mean by mail or other means, you are open to do this, but we run out of time. I want to thank you very much, Theo, Harold, Donna. I want to also thank very much Kayla and Anna for helping us, for preparing all these, you know, this infrastructure, everything, the videos and everything to have this wonderful conversation. And most important, the participants who pose these very exciting questions and allow us to have this very interesting conversation. So having said so, again, thank you everybody, and hope to see you all in Albuquerque in November in the next week. Thank you so much. Bye.
Okay, goodbye.
Thank you.